Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Kelsey Lefebvre. Before we get started, I'd like to offer a few technology tips to keep in mind while you're viewing today's webinar. First, all attendees are muted throughout the presentation. Once in a while, it is a good idea to tap your mouse so that your screen does not go to sleep during the presentation. There will be time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. Questions can be text chatted in at any point during the presentation. To send in your question, click on the question mark button in the right side of your screen to expand a question box where you can then type in your question. A recording of today's webinar as well as presentation materials will be available at farmcrediteast.com as well as on our YouTube channel for access after the webinar. Now, a quick disclaimer, this information is presented in good faith and is not meant to be intended for investment, tax, or legal advice. Today we have Mark Cannella joining us today. He is an Extension Associate Professor at the University of Vermont. And now I will hand it over to Mark.
All right. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. This is Mark Cannella, University of Vermont Extension. And thanks for your patience for a minute. We're going to get set up. I'm going to bring my slides on and we're going to double check that we've got audio and visual going okay. Step. Just going to ask if the slides are showing and if we've avoided the screen cutoff.
Yes, looks good.
Okay, great. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm looking forward to presenting 2025 U.S. Maple Outlook. Like you heard, I'm a Extension Associate Professor here at the University of Vermont. I have been working in the fields of farm and forest business for about 15 years, and over the past several years have been spending more time both doing direct programming, business management education, and applied research within the maple community. So when you hear from me, you hear about first someone who's pretty excited. I've got a background in maple syrup and some really early childhood memories. Got to make maple syrup for a few years working on an educational farm, and really can't say how luckily and privileged I feel to be able to work with maple producers over the past several years on some of the applied research projects. A group of people that have a real commitment to the land, commitment to the forests and forest stewardship. And as many of you may know, agriculture and forest businesses don't come without risk, don't come without challenges. So really appreciate the maple producers and business owners across the supply chain that invest a lot of their time and emotional energy into keeping this thing going through good times and bad. So today's agenda, we've got about an hour. I'm going to share some basics on annual production and economic trends within the U.S. maple syrup industry and global. We'll talk about Canada as well. A little bit on the U.S.-Canadian dynamic. And I'm going to shift into some sector priorities. Specifically, I'm going to focus on a few working groups that are active within the International Maple Syrup Institute, the IMSI. And then I've got a couple other sector priorities that I've picked up from interviews and collaboration with people, both producers, member association leaders, and then people in the supply chain. What I'd like to do is encourage you to ask questions or comments in the chat. It sounds like the way we'll moderate that is we'll catch them at the end. So I'll be sure to stop well before 1 o'clock. And what I'm hoping to do, I don't have a slide at the end that has strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. But what I'm hoping to offer you all the ability to engage is maybe start to take some notes, make some notes or write some things down, or be prepared to share as I go through this presentation. Interested to see what you think maybe some of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, or threats that come out from the different factors that I'll be presenting. So with that, I'm going to do a little bit of a screen adjustment so I can see the controls. Jump right in. Great. So quick reminder, and I think this certainly relates to you thinking about the SWOT. There's really like this dual or multi-identity in the maple industry. I know a lot of times working in the agricultural community, there's this term farmers, and then people in my field tend to like to use the word business managers, business owners, to try to deflect from sort of some of the emotion or the nostalgia of the farming practice compared to business management. But maple is very much the same. You get this idea of the maple industry, the maple sector. I think it's very clear to me, especially just being in New York State this past week at a conference and talking to producers, there's really this dual identity again, where you really have a number of large producers and sellers that operate in a really different environment than not just smaller, but I just say generally producers or sellers in localized markets, direct selling, maybe doing some wholesale within the region. So I want you to remember that, because what I'll share with you is going to be a number of features of the industry and the outlook. And I think the reaction to these situations is going to be very different depending on where you are based on scale, where you are based on preferred marketing channel, and where you are based on maybe your own performance, whether it's profitability or just meeting other owner expectations. So I want you to continue to emphasize that as you're thinking about it. Think about not just whether it's good or bad, but try to reflect on what you're thinking about as far as the business scale and how it relates to the market channel, because I think we're going to find different members of this industry or this sector are going to react very differently to what's going on around them, and possibly be doing better or worse in reaction to some of the same influences or factors. So to emphasize this, I'm going to go back to a survey that we did here at UVM in 2019. We surveyed a number of economic factors and features and outlook for producers in 2019. And what we found from a particular survey, mostly responded to by Northeastern maple producers. We had a few participants outside of what I would say New England Northeast. But in general, 82% of the reporting businesses were under 5,000 taps. In some parts of the country, 5,000 taps sounds like an enormous scale. In other parts of the country or in other parts of Vermont, 5,000 taps isn't small, but there is a prevalence of larger and much larger business operations, 20,000 taps, 40,000 taps, 90,000 taps. We don't have hundreds of them, but the impact of those larger businesses is significant. So let's just reflect on the fact that 82% of businesses in the maple community could be at a smaller scale under 5,000 taps. However, if we look at the impact on crop, the amount of syrup produced by all of those businesses, 100% of those businesses, 80% of that US crop was produced by 5,000 tap plus enterprises. However, by business count, that's only about 20% of the businesses. So if you look at that pie chart there, that 81%, it may be cut off a little bit for you, 81% of the crop is coming from those 5,000 tap plus businesses, but by count, that's only about 20% of the number of producers. And when we start talking about policy and representation, I think it's really important to reflect on crop volume, crop magnitude impact, pounds, gallons produced, gallons sold. It doesn't match up with number of people in business ownership positions, number of people represented on, say, county producer boards, or number of interactions that consumers may have, because some of those larger businesses maybe aren't as accessible compared to what we know and love in the Northeast, the community maple feel of community sugar houses and visiting people in that springtime season. So crop distribution relates to this kind of multi-identity within the industry. Let's look at most recent trends on production here. Looking at a chart from around 2002 to 2024. Some of you have seen this before. Do we know the direction that the maple industry is heading? It's a rapidly expanding industry, right? We've got in blue, we've got the US tap count. Most leaders would say that this is underreported. I'll talk a little bit more about statistical accuracy in upcoming slides, but we can still see this clear trajectory. The blue bar, a little over 6 million taps in 2002. Now 2024, almost at 18 million taps, right? We've got a 3x growth in 20 years, a rapidly growing industry. And I think it's notable in comparison to some of the other industries that many of us probably work with across the agricultural sector. We may see increasing volume of sales as a reflection of price or quantity, but this production unit is dramatic. This is an expanding production unit industry and has been for the past 20 years. The black line with those orange pegs is our US production. Those of you familiar with maple will know that there is no guarantee with maple syrup production. It's a highly sensitive crop to weather conditions. Specific weather conditions and freeze-thaw cycles will impact production on a daily basis. And then how the deep winter freeze transitions to an orderly springtime transition has a huge impact on how long that season lasts. And we're talking a production season that could maybe span over 2 to 3 months, but most producers will say they're actually producing fresh maple sap, possibly as few as 12 to 15 days, and maybe at most 25 days of sap flow, 365-day year, 25 days of actual production. So we've got, a high concentration of effort, high focused on short, small number of days. So you can see the bar charts. You can see we've had some flat times, we've had some ups and downs, we have some really strong years. I don't know how many times I've said we've got a record crop in recent history, and then the next year we have this drop off, and then the next year we have a record crop. But you can see the growth trajectory, again, starting down at that 2002 level. Just reflect on the fact that the domestic crop, even if slightly underreported, at roughly 3 million, I'm sorry, not 3 million, closer to about 1 million gallons of syrup, now upwards of 5, almost 6 million gallons of syrup. So again, we've got like 3, 4, 5x growth over 20 years. Dramatically growing industry. It's important to take a look down memory lane here, and let me explain this chart a little bit. We've got a PhD postdoc researcher, Dr. Emmanuel Ava, has been working with me over the past year. Pleased to have him at UVM, and we're trying to get some order to these time series data sets. So what you see here is on the far right, let's start on the far right. That's where we are now, 2024. We're actually back up around over 6 million gallons. And I've put some green dots in there just to emphasize the trend that I'm looking on. When we look backwards in history, we know that in the mid-1800s, the US syrup production or sugar production was around this large record peak. And for many, I'd say for the past several years, last 10 years, we've always been referring to this mid-1800s high point in maple syrup and sugar production. It's difficult to track because of the conversion of dry sugar to fluid syrup. The primary format of maple sugar has changed. It was more prevalent to have dry sugar production going back 150 years ago, pre-refrigeration, lighter weight for transport, many factors. And then we transitioned primarily to a fluid syrup economy in the 1900s. So it is difficult to track that 1850, but by and large, a lot of the estimates are that the US domestic crop was somewhere around those green dots. And for the past 10, 15 years, we've said we're experiencing rapid growth, but we're nowhere near the historical peak. And I'd say by 2024, when we look at those numbers, a lot of us are saying, wow, we're actually, US production is now at the level that it was over 150 years ago, which we think was the highest in history. So that's a look backwards. And then I also just like this one because when you put it in this context, you can see this dramatic growth. Some of the issues I'll talk about are going to reference policy, decision-making, evolution of an industry. And I think this chart emphasizes the magnitude of crop that's out there and how the footprint of the industry, the impact of the industry, it's more significant now than it was 20 years ago. And it does start to call to question, does this industry, do the producers, do the sellers have the right systems in place to keep up if this growth were to continue? We're going to look at the North American and or global tap count in the context of US and Canada. And some of these are statistics, and then the 2027 number for the US is going to be my estimate based on recent running averages. But I just want to emphasize that Canada has 80 to 85% of the global taps. US 15 to 20% of the global taps. We're going to focus on the US today. We can't understate the impact, leadership, influence of the Canadian syrup industry, primarily the province of Quebec, generating the majority of that crop from Canada. And what I want to show here and emphasize again is, despite this dramatic growth in the US, no discussion on the US maple outlook could be complete without reference to activity, volume, and scope of Canadian maple syrup production, and also Canadian expansion. So what you'll see is a 2021 US number. I've put our multi-year growth trends around 5% a year to sort of project where we might be in 2027. I took the same 2021 Canada statistical tap number and then added 14 million taps. PPAQ, the Canadian Maple Syrup Producers Association, does have a strategy for managing inventory, managing supply, and managing production. And they've released a number of taps, authorized taps to their members, upwards of almost 15 million new taps released that will come online over the next several years. But again, just to show that dramatic growth of the Canadian production expansion as well. I was hoping to not really talk about maple prices and currency today. I was really thinking we'd shift a little bit more on strategic outlook, but before we do that, I think we do have to recognize what's going on right now in the financial markets. So as of yesterday, we're looking at an exchange rate 144 CAD to $1 USD, right? This is high. It's been trending high for the past several months. I don't specialize in currency exchange. I did talk to someone and I said, what do you think is going to happen? And they looked at me and smiled and said, if I knew what was going to happen, I probably wouldn't be in the job I was in right now. It can be difficult to predict, but the levels are really high. The relevance to the US industry is that because of the dramatic need to import Canadian syrup to satisfy our US consumption demands, the US bulk market is always trying to reach parity with the Canadian import, and it can't be non-competitive on a price basis if they're going to continue to reach some of the same buyers. So when the Canadian dollar is at a low point or a weak point compared to the US dollar, the imports, they do flow into the US at a price advantage. And you can see this theoretical adjustment. I'm just going to peg a general golden price with PPAQ with a multi-year pricing. I haven't kept up with where their current announcement is, but I know it's around $3.20 per pound golden. Qualifier here, golden is not the most prevalent syrup grade that gets produced by our maple producers in the US. We're probably looking at pricing for amber and dark. So we want to be modest and know that this 320 is sort of the high bar, but the majority of that blended price that producers will receive is going to be, I'd say, at least a factor of 10 to 20 cents below this based on what the grade is. However, if we use that golden as a benchmark price, at 320 golden Canadian dollars, that means that the US buyers could possibly be doing adjustments down to 223 US pay price. Conclusion, there'd be going to be a lot of bulk US producers are going to feel challenged by that pay price. This slide goes back several years. I could guarantee that the cost of production has gone up for US producers since this was done. This was late teens that we put this together, so this could be over 5 years old. But if you look at the far right, some of our largest producers, the 15,000 plus in this study, I want to emphasize that, less on scale, but because almost all of the producers in our cost of production study at that point were bulk sellers, so they didn't have direct marketing costs or sales costs, like you would see with some of the smaller operations on the left-hand bars. But that right-hand bar, that 232 cost of production, is something we saw consistently over several years of financial research. 220, 230, 240 is about where some of the strongest managers with some of the strongest, well above average yields were hitting for cost of production. So that idea of being around 220, if that's the case, is certainly a challenging price point. We do know that there's usually a consistent, significant premium for organic syrup, and with that, made possibly 220 or lower price point that U.S. producers are possibly going to be facing and have faced in the past. You can understand why a lot of the producers, if possible, are making transition to certified organic production, could come with a 10 to 15 cent price premium, and that could be enough just to get people in a better situation to meet cost of production, meet margin. This is another one I didn't really want to talk about, but I was in New York State this weekend and had a really productive conversations with producers at the conference there. So I think we should just spend a moment and reflect on the fact that there's some signaling out of a incoming administration that the legally binding U.S. Canada-Mexico trade agreement that was put in place not too long ago is possibly not going to be relevant, to be determined if these, I don't know if we call these policies or negotiations or media cycle threats will manifest, but in the potential of a 20%, 25% tariff, what could we expect? I don't work in import-export of syrup, but I try to understand what's going on, and this is my take on it from talking to a few people and trying to understand the dynamics. What happens if we have a 25% tariff? Well, I think U.S. producers would theoretically be happy at first. If the price of that Canadian import goes up 25%, that's possibly over 50 cents a pound. What I just showed you, that currency adjustment based on the weak Canadian dollar, could actually be offset by an increase in price. I think it'll be difficult for buyers to stay to a parity price on the old price. It's gonna parity on a new price. So we're gonna have a possible increase in pay price to U.S. producers. Sounds great. Now, we do have to then factor in that 55 to 60% of U.S. consumption is coming from Canada. So U.S. pay price goes up, Canadian syrup flows over the border at a much higher price. All the major buyers and retailers that are excited to see this industry expand are now looking at dramatic pay increases and passing that on to customers. U.S. markets. There's a potential that a 25% increase in syrup prices, and this is at the import level, and if you think about price transmission, a 25% increase, probably, I think, unless people are going to shave their own margins, is probably going to result in possibly a larger increase at the final retail sale level. It could have a chilling effect on the market growth. It could impact some of the relationships, some of the former agreements. And this is a question I have. Maple producers are often talking about wanting to get paid better, but they seem quite pleased in the U.S. to continue to expand production. So I think we have a price quantity kind of paradox here where U.S. producers are excited, high prices. What's going to happen with U.S. markets? Could it chill demand immediately and create maybe some surplus inventories, or would it maybe slow demand in a more staged process? So I'm kind of leaving this one as I don't know. I don't know. Put some comments. I'd love to hear people's feedback, and we can talk about this maybe in like 20 minutes. So I'm going to shift over to some of the strategic outlook and get past some of that tactical and possible crisis management that is going to be very real. And discuss briefly a few of the committees, the working groups that are going on with the International Maple Syrup Institute. And I think this is a nice way to take a longer view look at the industry and some of the opportunities, some of the challenges, and some of the needs. So I'm going to go through a few of these committees and then bring it back around, get some comments from you all. So there's been a U.S. Statistics Committee that's been in place for several years, and I think it's important, especially when we look at statistics, to recognize that this committee worked really hard to change the instrument that the USDA was collecting maple production statistics on an annual basis from producers by. So we changed the instrument, we shortened it dramatically, and there's still an emphasis now on trying to get the word out to get increased participation. The industry has, over the past several years, watched the growth trends and felt like the growth trend is correct, but felt like the numbers were really underreported. And so the hope is now that there is going to be an increased level of participation and we can get more accurate statistics. Well, why does this matter? If the trends are good enough, I think one of the things that I've been asked is from a US perspective, from a Vermont, New York, or all US perspective, do we really have our hands around the economic impact? Powerful numbers to share with state legislatures as far as funding for state initiatives, and then also significant if we start trying to manifest federal policy and actually measure the industry. So while we can show dramatic growth, not having an accurate pinpoint on the actual number, magnitude of taps, magnitude of gross sales or farm value sales, it does challenge the industry to communicate its impact to other players. So there's a goal to do that. That committee is not as active as it was. It's, I think, in some ways accomplished its initial task to revise the survey, but I think it's really important to recognize the importance of these statistics moving forward, especially as the industry grows. Standard of Identity is another committee of the IMSI. I want to read a little bit briefly from the report that we put out. So the Standard of Identity Committee is really looking to update both US and Canadian standards of identities, or SOIs. And the goal is to get this identity and registration formalized or updated within Codex, C-O-D-E-X. It's a set of internationally accepted standards and guidelines that identifies what the product is, how it was produced, and some of the criteria for meeting that definition. Right now, there are some inconsistencies with the SOIs that are currently present for maple syrup producing states or provinces. So the goal here, I think, recognizes the need to standardize. This is becoming, I don't say, well, it's a specialty crop, but I think we could say it's a commodity in that it's going to be more broadly traded and globally traded as the industry expands, and there's a need to have uniformity. And then we also recognize the modernization of maple processing. So there's still a few things in the language about salt, chemical preservatives, or lack of clarity on processing agents like defoamer. And so this industry that really prides itself as being a pure product is going to need to update this identity, especially if they want to communicate that to these broader sales channels globally. So this is going on. This is a long-term process, and there's some committed people at the IMSI and certainly in the business community that want to see this happen. So that's an initiative, I think, that reflects sort of the, I'd say, the globalization of maple, whether you like to hear it or not, the opportunity to share maple across different hemispheres and participate in those trading formats to do it. Another really interesting committee that I can't speak on the technical side, but the isopropyl alcohol approval initiative is underway with IMSI. It's a material that's currently available and legal for use in Canada, and by my understanding, a lot of the larger producers have adopted isopropyl alcohol as a way to clean and sanitize their tubing systems. Given the adoption rate in Canada, the assumption is that this is an effective strategy to reduce microbial and biological buildup in the tubing systems, which could ideally allow maple sap tap holes to remain open and flowing for longer in the season, and to also extend the lifespan on the investment in these tubing systems. So there's a committee underway. They're making progress working through the policy and regulatory hoops within Washington, D.C. and the federal agencies in order to get approval. I'm told they're making progress. It, again, is a slow process, but something that could be a real benefit to U.S. producers in the future. Again, here we're talking about positioning this industry through, working through regulatory agencies and working through larger governance structures in order to get this industry in a place that it can do what it wants to do. I've got two more committees I want to reference then, and some of these slides that follow are gonna fit into these categories. IMSA also has an environment and sustainable development working group that's been established. One of the big topic of the recent meeting this past summer was really about climate change and how producers are perceiving the situation, how they're dealing with that, and then also how we're responding to just the changes in the environment from a business perspective, as well as a marketing and communications perspective. So I'm going to talk about that for a few slides. And then towards the end, I'm going to talk about research that I'm working on specifically. IMSI has an industry-funded market development committee. It first was called the Sustainable Funding Committee, and it switched to market development. The emphasis of this committee has been to explore if the U.S. maple industry could, would, should, wants to adopt a generic promotion and education program similar to other agricultural and forest products in the U.S. So I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So let's talk about climate change and this environment committee. People are talking about it, people are thinking about it, and as well they should. The numbers are pretty staggering when you look at some of the changes in our atmospheric environments, and we see some of the changes in weather patterns, and then understanding how short-term weather and long-term trends intersect with maple is a little more complicated. So we're looking at crop volatility, and I know a few other people are considering, like, what do we consider crop failure, and is this climate thing going to impact our crop production? So again, working with Dr. Abba, we've been looking at this coefficient of variation, which is a coefficient of variation is not looking at the scale of the crop, but it's looking at the variability from year to year. So Emmanuel and I were doing some 10-year and 5-year averages, and what I'm showing you right now is the best we can collect based on those statistics that we are somewhat concerned about their accuracy. Again, a nod to the importance of statistics here. But looking at this coefficient of variation using 5-year averages from the early 1900s to present, you can see this downward trend line, which is actually saying our crops are getting less variable. We're seeing less swings when you accommodate and adjust for the growth rates, and that gets equalized statistically. Dr. Abba is saying, yeah, actually seeing this slight reduction over time in the coefficient of variation. So despite the fact that we maybe have concerning weather patterns, questionable how climate interacts with those annual weather cycles that impact the sap flow, there is this feeling that the rapid adoption of sanitation, tapping practices, high vacuum tubing systems, and all the improvements that come with that have actually enabled maple producers to reduce their variability or their production volatility from year to year. That would be a good thing. Looking at 2024 in the US specifically, the all US average 0.34 gallons per tap, which is the second highest yield recorded in the past 25 years. So despite some possible fluctuations in some bad crop years, we're possibly seeing the volatility reduced, and we're seeing some record yields. That's good. Should we stop talking about climate change? I think what we learned from the meeting this summer with the International Maple Syrup Institute, members from Canada and the US at all scales, is there's really a need to adopt a broader perspective on risk exposure. And we need to really prepare for business level disruption, both during and between production seasons, that sap production season. And this is a consistent conversation, at least myself as a business management specialist and economist is a part of, is that this is an industry that's still pretty focused on production, pretty focused on yields. Do any of you work with other agricultural industries that are still pretty focused on production, pretty focused on yields? Labor efficiency, if we get our yields up, our cost of production per unit goes down. We know this. It's not a problem. I mean, it's not a bad thing. This is naturally how a lot of these producers and advisors think. But what I will emphasize is that I think this industry, the maple industry, its outlook is that it needs to adopt a broader perspective. It cannot just focus on crop yield and say, well, climate change is not a concern. Uh, and here's why. We've got possible wind events or reoccurring wind events that may not impact the syrup supply in the United States, but it has the potential to absolutely devastate localized businesses, right? We've got possibilities for long and permanent timber stand damage from windstorms, which we know are coming at higher frequencies and at higher intensities. We've got a lot of exposure out there with tubing systems. And as a perennial tree, perennial non-timber forest product, the second those trees are impaired or dead, the ability to produce income from that plot is going to go down immediately and not recover. It won't. You can't replant a maple tree and start tapping it in 2 years. So we've got things like wind damage. We've got pest infestations, invasives on the plant side, and also pests coming in on the insect side. We don't quite have our head around that, but the general forecast is that warmer temperatures, less intense winter freezes could increase pest populations in whatever form, whatever species they may be. And so there's a concern about that. There's a concern about increased defoliation, if not tree death from a windstorm, maybe tree morbidity, declining tree health, and the ability for that tree to be productive and produce sweet sap year after year. So that's on the forest side. Again, mid to long term, not easy to predict, but if we're thinking outlook here, I think we need to be thinking less about annual crop production and some of these mid long term factors. And the last one there I'm going to put down is power outages and service disruptions. Again, let's shift our thinking a little bit from can we make more sap and talk a little bit more seriously about like what are the service disruptions that could really impact things. And we've seen this in Vermont, unfortunately, 2 years of severe flooding. So we do know what it's like for localized areas to lose power. And do you have backups? Do you have redundancy in your system? To lose communication, to be able to lose, for a small producer that's got an online sales transaction format, the idea of losing internet for 2 or 3 days and losing sales or losing IT services could be dramatic. So I want to focus on some of these non-farming, non-forestry factors as far as climate goes as well. Phone, IT, power, all these things could have a big impact moving forward. Not insurmountable, but it's important to have some plans and contingencies in place. So moving from the risks, I think it's really good and important to look at climate forward strategy and some of the upside. And I'm just going to frame this as trying to figure out really in this industry that's still evolving, can we match producer and production performance with consumer demand? Here's 2 examples of projects that I'm aware of, if not involved in a little bit. Bird Friendly Maple is a newer program. Well, let's see, new, 10 plus years old. Steve, if you're on, you could give the dates here. But the idea of putting an emphasis on biodiversity and habitat, and producers may find this very important. And then the question is, how does this resonate in the marketplace? And when we look at localized markets for syrup, for those, remember those 80% of the producers that are possibly marketing quite locally, is this a feature that's going to resonate and make people want to continue to buy their syrup and maybe experience their sugar bush? And then below here, I put the classic kind of carbon footprint. This is something that came up a lot at the June meeting with the IMSI, this idea of life cycle analysis, and it's in process. There are researchers looking at this for maple and trying to understand what is the overall carbon or resource impact of the maple production system as well as the maple distribution. I can guarantee that most industries are trying to figure this out as well. So from a competitive standpoint, I think all would agree that US maple as well as Canadian maple needs to get their head around this. To be determined if the carbon footprint is low, and the low compared to another industry is going to be the selling point or the value proposition, or to be determined if telling the story that there's a group of people that have sustainability mindset are looking to make improvements is going to be the storyline. And I don't have the answer for that, but I know there's a lot of people researching it and talking about it. And I've got a select group of producers that contact me regularly and ask me to put something out because they feel like their buyers and their more broad domestic consumers want a carbon story, are going to be wanting more of a carbon story in the years to come. So a few more industry priorities. This is coming from some of the producers and sellers: syrup quality, quality assurance, workforce labor, and aging ownership. And again, I just want to remind you this kind of dual multi-identity in the maple industry. Like, are we talking about large producers, large sellers? Are we talking about smaller scale producers or more direct channel, direct to consumer sellers? So think about this in relation to all of these factors. I'm going to talk a little bit about maple quality. UVM and partners in Vermont and within some of the national or state associations have been doing syrup contests on a regular basis in general. And unfortunately, often they'll say about 1/3 or 30% of the entries to contests, just people putting their best foot forward, their best product in the contest. 30% often don't meet the basic grading criteria. So this is, I say, at that smaller producer scale, certainly a risk. You know, it's a high cost sweetener. It's a terrific product. The last thing anyone wants is for a new customer to have a poor experience with that product. We've been doing research for this is our third cycle. I'm only showing you 2 years here, where UVM's been purchasing syrup online. Again, this is not from contests. This is not the best of that people submit. This is just from the online marketplace. We've been buying samples and testing for the 4 grades of color, clarity, flavor, and density. I'm just going to give you a couple quick results here, especially thinking about some of the smaller scale direct marketers. Let's look at 2023, 2024. 2023 is that kind of dark blue, and then 2024 is the lighter gray. This is for golden syrup that we purchased online in the past 2 years. And you can see, I'm just going to shift over clarity, the second set of bars on the left, looking pretty good. Flavor for golden, 90 to 100% compliance. Density, 84, 86. So there's still some correction on getting accurate density measurements. But look at the percent compliance. When we purchased syrup online over the past 2 years, we tested for color compliance with the standard grades: golden, amber, dark, very dark. The syrups purchased as golden, 21% this year, 22% actually met the standard. 80% of the samples were too dark to meet the golden grade. And similarly, last year, 26% were in, which meant 75 were out of compliance. This is a big issue. I'm not going to get into supply chain and maple packaging. Syrup does darken over time, especially in certain types of packaging and containers. This is an issue that people need to be aware of. Golden syrup is certainly at risk for darkening, and I would say at this point, I couldn't confidently buy syrup online advertised as golden, and given this stat, expect that it's actually going to be golden color when it comes out of the bottle. Here's our results for dark syrup 23, 2024. Again, purchased syrup online. We purchased dark syrup pints. And I've just highlighted the 2 most concerning standards. For color, definitely not as bad as golden, but 65% compliance with the color grade. So 35% of these samples that we purchased as a certain type of product did not meet that standard. And then for flavor here, if you think back, the golden, I think our flavor compliance was 95% plus. Pretty easy to detect off flavors, contamination, some sort of fouling of the product through bad sap or maybe bad processing or soap or cleaners. Pretty easy to pick that up with golden. However, darker colored syrup, not as easy to pick that up. We found that 73 to 79% were in compliance, which means roughly 20 to 25% of those samples had what we would say is not just a present off flavor at a small amount, but at this level, we said that we wouldn't, if we were running a contest, this would be a reject. This would be an off flavor that's of the intensity that we would not accept it or consider it as something that should have been sold for retail. So this is why the industry cares, right? This is syrup that either is going to have a good or bad impact on a customer, or for someone who's buying in syrup, bulk syrup and repackaging, the possibility of getting not just good barrels, but also possibly some bad barrels in the mix and having to figure out how to move that product down to consumers or different markets, if not for consumer consumption directly. Okay, quality assurance, not my specialty, but from our industry panels over the past few months, you could hear clearly the larger bulk syrup buyers. We know that the industry footprint is growing through major retail brands and large sellers across the US. So these are the big stores, the big retail brands and the big club stores. And these buyers are putting an increasing scrutiny on food quality and quality assurances. So that's knowing that they can verify where the product came from and that it's safe, where there can be different inputs or packaging can be traceable. So this is something that the larger buyers are going to they're experiencing it now, and they will be passing these needs, demands, requests on to their suppliers. So there's a lot of larger producers or bulk producers that should be prepared for possible, not just intention, but possible requirements to meet certain standards or to track certain things so that that product can flow through to those channels and be acceptable. Does this one sound familiar for anyone working in agriculture or forestry and anything other than maple? Average age of the Northeast maple producer owners from our 2019 survey, 55 years. What's the next generation going to look like? We know that maple has dramatically high capital costs. When I've done my financial work, 20 to 26% depreciation on annual revenue. That's possibly double what some other industries are looking at. High capital investment, very modernized, a lot of technology to enhance those yields like we talked about, maybe reduce the variability of crop from year to year. But there's going to be some difficulty for accessing capital for the next generation as well. We've got outdoor physical seasonal labor demands. Sound familiar? Low profits. Sound familiar? Lower wage rates. So there's a number of things that are challenging the workforce. And if this industry is going to continue to grow, I think there's obviously the goal to mechanize and try to automate certain processes, but you can't get around being in the woods, putting up trees and maintaining tubing systems. So I'm just going to forecast some things that are going to need to be on the horizon for the maple industry strategically. Some sort of capital access program or initiatives for young quote new owners, even if they're in their 40s, and that could be debt, could be equity, could be ownership partnerships. For sure, it doesn't necessarily have to be traditional commercial debt. And then labor policy, labor programs. Does this sound familiar to anyone that works in the agricultural sector? Will it be possible for every sector to manifest the appropriate labor program that possibly implicates human beings, workers that aren't working in that system 365 days a year? It's a challenge. It can be done, and I think this is going to be a newer phase for the maple industry to get its head around if it can get enough willing and talented workers in these rural forested areas. Okay, a couple more slides quickly before we wrap up. I'm making that switch now from quality, workforce. We talked about environment a little bit. And this is one of the looming questions that I've been asked to help research is, does the maple industry want to manifest some sort of universal promotion program to promote US syrup? And let me qualify, it may not be to promote, quote, US syrup, but the idea of a generic and pre-competitive promotion program to educate consumers on the product category of pure maple syrup. You've got some examples here of other industries that have adopted mandatory programs, so the USDA, Vidalia Onions, National Honey Board's a research and promotion program. I picked Oregon hazelnuts and popcorn to share because those are both smaller industries in the US, but they have manifested a governance program for mandatory promotion. So a couple of the themes, I'm doing industry research right now, interviewing a number of producers, buyers, and agency association representatives. A couple of different options, right? Some people want to talk about private ordering. They don't want the government involved. So we're having conversations. What's the likelihood that a cooperative may form, some sort of collective cooperative, or a voluntary checkoff Many industries had voluntary checkoffs through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Unfortunately, if we look at history, a lot of those voluntary checkoffs have adapted and transitioned to mandatory promotion programs. They've gone from voluntary status and gone under the USDA umbrella in order to maintain mandatory participation. It's difficult to run a program and they've on volunteer payments, and those volunteer payments have not been consistent for some of those other sectors historically, and they made the transition. Another option here, we could go 100% public. We could just rely on agency grant programs. There could be a lot of money. There is increased money flowing into the maple industry via USDA funding sources. So it's definitely an option. Biggest concern that's been coming up about these public programs is the industry doesn't quite feel like it's got leverage or representation on decision making, priority setting, and maybe awardee selection. So possibly a lot of money, possibly some challenges for the maple industry to determine how that money gets spent. And then back to the mandatory program, these what I call hybrid ordering mechanisms. USDA Agricultural Marketing Services has market orders, which are somewhat complicated with different features and tools, and then also has these research and promotion programs, which many specialty crop industries have adopted as ways to manifest a program. These are mandatory programs, which means that once the program is in development, a referendum vote is presented to all the participants that would be covered by it. And the referendum vote has to pass by majority in order for the program to be enacted. So there's a step for the industry to ask its producers if it wants to participate, and they can vote in or vote out. And where we're at with the research is nowhere near ready for a vote. It's just trying to communicate what these programs are and get people's feedback within the industry if they may be interested. So I'm going to close off with a little bit of the inside scoop. I've been interviewing people and just some different perspectives. Is a mandatory promotion program desirable? Some people are saying, yes, please, like I'm all in. Well, why? People want to see if there's a way to get some price control, whether it's through market growth or even through cross-border tariffs. These are all possibilities. I'm not saying they should be pursued, but other U.S. agricultural sectors have decided that if we grow markets, we can get paid better. And if we do something at the border, we could possibly change the pricing dynamic with our international suppliers. Changing demographics and the market outlook is another one. There's a lot of concern that the maple industry is growing rapidly right now, but doesn't quite know how it's going to grow or maintain sales when the 20s become 30-year-olds and the 30-year-olds become 40-year-olds. So there's some questions about that. I'd say one of the prevailing interests that I've observed from people that want to go this direction is it's all about representation, participation, and contribution. U.S. maple producers know that the primary supply of syrup coming from the province of Quebec is coming from a member union, people that have decided to collectively organize, and they contribute to international marketing and research funds through their organization, through the PPAQ. And there's a lot of U.S. producers that would like to see the U.S. manifest that same sort of collective action and that collective contribution to say we're putting in a couple pennies a pound. And we've got people on the other side, you know, no critique on them, but I heard a lot of nopes, nah, not for me. Some of the critiques, if this industry's grown 4 or 5 times in the past 20 years and the sellers and the markets are keeping up, you know, what's the problem? Why would some sort of public board do a better job than the private actors that have done a great job moving a huge supply? Generally, this idea that the U.S., at least the maple forest landowners group, lacks a collective action mindset. It's not quite in their nature, not something they're really familiar with. And then I'd really focus on this dual industry identity issue where we've got probably a mix of people in different market channels that would like to be involved in strategic planning for the industry. Some of them are at small scales. And I think there's a real kind of dynamic where a lot of the larger sellers that are operating quite fine independently are saying, I'm just operating at a different volume. I got different expectations and I'm fine doing it our way. So we've got both things going on. That's just a quick preview. I did want to note one more thing on maple or market development before I close out here. I want to reference that there has been a recent clinical health study on maple and cardiometabolic health encourage you to check it out if you want more at all. It's in the Journal of Nutrition. I don't want to emphasize it today, but I don't want to talk about market development, talk about climate, talk about promotion programs, and fail to mention what I think is some pretty cutting edge research for maple and possible applications in the nutritional field. And I don't want to advocate, but I want to encourage you to check it out and see what you think about the results. So I'm going to wrap it up right here and just say it's an evolving industry. It's growing rapidly. I think some of these opportunities and challenges that you maybe noted are certainly a reflection of, we've got some legacy situations and setups. We've got different leadership coming from associations and large business owners. And a lot of the stuff's leading to policy. A lot of the stuff that I've been working on has been leading to policy. And this is a new era for this maple industry to consider how it will manifest policy and what that policy will do and for whom. I'm going to stop there. I hope there's some questions and comments, and I'm certainly glad to stay on for as long as it lasts. And I respect a lot of people that only have a couple minutes before the lunch break is over and need to go.
Yeah, it looks like we have quite a few questions.
Okay,
So
great.
first up, can you talk a little bit more about the organic demand? How much is still available? Are we going to reach a point where too many producers are converting to organic, where it outpaces the demand and then impacts the premium?
Yeah, great question. I can't say for sure, but I would say we can just watch the organic premium payments coming from the bulk buyers every year. They've stayed at roughly 20 cents per pound US, maybe up or down in certain years. And I think if we start to see those premiums go down, then that would be a good signal. My understanding right now is that the organic syrup category has some of the highest impact on the growth rate of maple. As maple gets traded in volume across the US, it is the organic syrup that's selling. And that is the signifier that these more dispersed markets are looking for, that's drawing them towards this product. So I don't really have a concern on that, but I think we could watch the premiums and see what happens.
Great. And then the next one is about growth. How much longer do you think we'll be able to continue to at this level of growth for the industry?
Yeah, I think the industry is going to grow, but I don't think everyone in the industry is going to be growing. And I think that's sort of that multi-identity thing. I think that there's larger producers that may be less capital sensitive if they're in good situations or they've got equity behind them, that could be quite content growing. And the possibility is that some pricing pressures with the broader markets are going to really encourage large scale maple expansions for that part of the industry, to try to maybe get those cost of production down and try to find a way to perform at those markets. And then we've got the 80% of those producers that are producing at smaller scale and selling locally are going to be operating in a different framework. And a lot of them, I think, have the ability to grow, but their growth doesn't have that same crop volume impact that those larger producers do. So I'd say there's growth in volume, and there's probably still growth in sort of community and sort of localized food systems maple, but they're going to get measured differently.
And
I
then
do
can
want
you
to
touch?
say, I also want to say that I think we can't forget the fact that there are some concerns that the price setting that's accomplished by the Quebec maple producers reflects a cost that they've agreed to. And I think I do hear some rumblings from the US community that they're just not quite sure if parity pricing with Canadian syrup is in our best interest long term. Not critiquing anybody with what they're doing with their business decisions daily, but that Canada agrees on their cost of production because they know what their cost of production is. And I've had a lot of people tell me that they just think the US cost of production is a touch higher, and that's challenging for some.
Yeah, and we have another question about international cooperation, kind of solving big issues. I guess if you can touch a little more on the US-Canada relationship and how you see that playing out for 2025.
Yeah, that's great. I just say at the maple community, we've got some great organizations. People get together and talk and share what they want to talk about. But one of the possibilities is, I think the US continues to talk about does it need to have some sort of national forum? We've got state associations. There's a North American and an international syrup group, but there isn't like a national maple representative group. And so that's for maple specific. That is something that I think people are starting to want to talk about. No decisions made, just an awareness. And that's in reflection of both the US Canadian dynamic, having a national sort of decision or strategy, but also all these other policy decisions are leading to maybe like national representation. As far as the US Canada trade negotiations, I don't work in that space. My concern is that maple is a very small industry by US standards, and it just could be collateral damage and whatever else is going on.
Do you have any insight into the 2025 season regarding climate projections? Will it be another early season like last year?
I have no projection on the weather. I know people want to know, but every year is different. And the cool thing is the maple producing community knows this and continues to make investments and commit to it. So we will tell you on May 15th.
Okay, and then looks like there's one more. What are your thoughts about standardizing and regulating requirements within the sugar house to produce and sell value-added products?
Yeah, great question. Most specialty food markets like standardization and they like verification of food safety. Regulation is something that most producers don't want to deal with if they're not familiar with it. And I think that it's going to really depend on people's outlook. And I work with producers that are quite comfortable with parameters and criteria because that's the way they're geared and they're looking to meet their buyers where they're at. And I work with other people that work with smaller, they're just working at a smaller scale and they're working with a clientele or community that's not pushing those same things. So again, I think this is that duality of the industry. There are certain products that very well, I don't know if they should be regulated, but I know Vermont's got a voluntary sugar house certification program going. It's voluntary, it's not regulated, but I think that sends the signal that the industry recognizes that it's important to make quality assurances. And so I certainly hope that the maple community at large adopts that mentality, and whether it flows through regulation or voluntary programs, I'd say that it's an expensive sugar and it's a really special product. I don't see any issue other than it being a change and being maybe expensive to make the transition, but I think the marketplace will respect that if it does.
Okay, and then one last one came in. What are your thoughts on if there will be more financial support in the future for zero carbon production?
Yeah, we're doing research right now on that with UVM. We've got consumer demand studies going across the US asking from a consumer perspective, what are the attributes they're interested in? And I'm working with some more statistical economists where we've got an experiment in the survey where we're actually going to try to understand when people say they're interested in carbon, not necessarily carbon zero, but carbon reduction or some sort of reduced carbon footprint, if they're actually going to pay a premium for that. So that's a research question that we have as well. Same question. We know that in general, the specialty foods and the higher tier product markets are paying attention to carbon. What we don't know is if the consumers of maple are interested and or if they're going to pay more for it. So I think that's it. From a consumer perspective and a pricing perspective, that's still that's an open question. And it's a great question.
Okay, that's all of our questions. Thank you again, Mark. And just a reminder that the recording and Mark's presentation slides will be available at farmcrediteast.com. Thank you all for joining today.
Great. Thanks, everybody.